For 10,000 years, humanity has whispered the same sacred lie into the void: the Emperor is immortal. It is spoken with reverence, with fear, with desperate hope. A god upon a throne of gold. A light in the endless dark. A being so vast, so powerful, that death itself broke against him and failed. But what if that belief is wrong, not slightly wrong, but catastrophically so? What if immortality was never his triumph, but his sentence? Consider this: across the Imperium, death is everywhere. Worlds burn, armies vanish, entire civilizations are erased in moments. And yet at the center of it all, there is a single being who does not die, no matter how grievous the wound, no matter how complete the ruin of his body. Not because he is whole, not because he is healed, but because someone, will not let him go. The Emperor endures, locked in a state between life and death, suspended in a moment that should have ended 10 millennia ago. The Imperium calls this survival. The Ecclesiarchy calls it divinity. But survival and salvation are not the same thing. There are fates far worse than death, especially for a mind vast enough to comprehend eternity. To exist without rest, to suffer without release, to feel every second of time grind forward while your body rots, your soul burns, and your thoughts are slowly crushed into fragments of instinct and agony. If that is immortality, then it is not a blessing, it is a horror beyond comprehension. The truth is buried beneath ritual and incense, beneath prayer and propaganda, beneath the screaming machinery of the Golden Throne itself. Humanity is taught to look upon the Emperor and see a god sustaining them out of infinite love. They are never taught to ask how. They are never taught to ask why. And above all, they are never taught to ask whether the Emperor wanted this fate at all. Because the moment that question is asked, the foundations of the Imperium begin to crack. What if the Emperor is not ruling, not watching, not guiding, but enduring? What if every miracle attributed to him is not an act of will, but a reflex of pain? What if the light of the Astronomican is not a beacon of hope, but the psychic scream of a being who cannot die, cannot heal, and cannot escape? A scream so vast it must be fed with souls just to keep it burning. This is the dark truth humanity cannot face, that the Emperor's immortality may not be proof of his godhood, but evidence of the greatest crime ever committed in the name of survival. A crime so absolute that even chaos itself could not have devised a punishment more cruel. Because to die is to end. But to live forever in torment, that is something else entirely. And if that is true, if the Emperor of mankind is not a living god but an eternal prisoner, then the Imperium is not being protected by him. It is being held together by his suffering. Before there was a god on a golden throne, before there were legions, banners, and prayers whispered in fear, there was a man, ancient, brilliant, and profoundly afraid. Not of enemies, not of failure, but of the one certainty no amount of power had ever truly conquered. Death. The Emperor did not begin as a symbol. He began as a mind that understood too much and lived too long, watching empires rise and collapse like brief, meaningless sparks in a universe that devoured everything in time. To understand the truth behind his immortality, we have to strip away the worship and return to the origin point, long before the Imperium, long before Terra burned with unity wars. In those forgotten ages, the Emperor walked among humanity not as a god, but as a guide, a ruler, a manipulator. He wore countless faces, lived countless lives, and always remained just out of reach of history. Yet even then, despite his immense psychic power and genetic perfection, he was not untouched by time. He endured it. And endurance is not the same as invincibility. The Emperor knew something most beings never grasp: death is not the end when the warp exists. Souls do not simply vanish. They are pulled apart, consumed, twisted, or enslaved by forces beyond comprehension. To a lesser mind, this would be abstract horror. To the Emperor, it was a certainty he could perceive, measure, and fear. He did not dread oblivion. He dreaded eternity without control. Because to die as a psychic being of his magnitude was not rest, it was annihilation through endless torment. This fear shaped everything that followed. His secrecy, his cruelty, his refusal to trust even those closest to him. Every step he took toward unity, every war he waged in the name of progress, was driven by a single unspoken objective: to build a reality where he would never have to face what awaited him beyond death. Humanity was not just a species to be saved. It was a shield, a system, an anchor against the warp itself. And here is where the lie begins to form. Immortality, as the Imperium teaches it, is effortless, divine, clean. But the Emperor's version was none of these things. It was engineered, maintained, fought for at unimaginable cost. His body could regenerate, yes, but his soul endured strain no being was ever meant to bear. Every century weighed on him. Every use of his power burned something away that never fully returned. He was surviving, not transcending. If you're still watching, understand this: what comes next will fundamentally change how you see the Emperor, the Primarchs, and the Golden Throne itself. By the end of this video, you'll understand why immortality was never his greatest achievement, and why it may be the darkest mistake humanity ever made. Stay until the end, and you'll see how a single fear condemned an entire galaxy to endless war and suffering. Because once you accept that the Emperor feared death, everything else begins to make terrible sense. His obsession with control, his refusal to allow faith, his desperate need to dominate the future rather than trust it. This was not arrogance alone. This was a man who had seen what waited beyond the veil, and chose any fate, no matter how cruel, rather than face it. And that choice is where the real story of the Emperor's immortality truly begins. Once you accept that the Emperor feared death, the next truth becomes unavoidable. His immortality was not a natural trait, and it was never guaranteed. It was a fragile state, constantly maintained, constantly threatened. The Imperium teaches that the Emperor is invincible, but invincibility implies effortlessness. In reality, everything about the Emperor's continued existence suggests strain, limits being pushed, boundaries being tested, and a cost that kept rising with every passing millennium. Immortality and invulnerability are not the same thing, and the Emperor understood this better than anyone. His body could heal, yes, but healing is a process, not a miracle. Wounds still hurt. Damage still mattered. More importantly, the warp does not attack flesh alone. It erodes identity, memory, and coherence. The Emperor's greatest vulnerability was never physical destruction. It was psychic erosion. The slow, grinding loss of self that comes from existing too long in a universe where thought itself can be weaponized. Over centuries, then millennia, the Emperor began to show signs not of decay, but of exhaustion. Not something that could be recorded in texts or observed by ordinary humans, but something felt by those sensitive enough to stand in his presence. His silence grew longer. His distance widened. His reliance on preparation and contingency deepened. These were not the behaviors of a god secure in eternity. They were the behaviors of a being who knew that immortality could fail. And when immortality fails, it does not fail cleanly. To truly die, the Emperor would not simply pass into nothingness. His soul, immense and blazing, would become a beacon in the warp, drawing the attention of every predatory entity that feeds on suffering and power. He would not be consumed quickly. He would be fought over, torn apart, reshaped, and weaponized. This was the fate he sought to avoid at all costs. Not extinction, but eternal violation. A consciousness too powerful to escape, too aware to break. This is why the Emperor's plans were never about peace. Peace implies an end state, a moment where effort stops. His plans were about stabilization, holding reality in a narrow, controlled shape where the warp could be kept at bay and his own existence could remain anchored. Humanity, united and rational, was meant to act as a psychic buffer. Faith was rejected not because he hated religion, but because belief empowers the warp. Emotion feeds it, and anything that strengthened the warp strengthened the thing waiting for him beyond death. Immortality, then, became a balancing act. Stay alive long enough to finish the project. Finish the project to make death survivable. Delay death until death could no longer hurt him. This was the logic that governed everything. And it was a logic built on fear, not wisdom. Because the longer the Emperor endured, the more the warp adapted. Chaos does not rush. It waits. It learns. It reshapes itself around resistance. Every century the Emperor survived without dying gave the warp more time to entangle itself with his existence. His power became a pressure point in reality. His continued life became a paradox the universe strained to resolve. This is the cruel irony at the heart of his immortality. The longer he lived to avoid damnation, the more catastrophic his eventual failure would become. Immortality was not an escape from consequence, it was a multiplier. A way of ensuring that when the balance finally broke, it would break everything with it. And that is why the Emperor did something no immortal should ever do. He sought power not meant to be held. In the next part, we'll uncover the moment the Emperor crossed the point of no return, the bargain, the theft, and the silence that followed, and why from that moment on, his immortality was never truly his own. At some point in the Emperor's long existence, fear stopped being a motivator and became a deadline. Knowledge alone was no longer enough. Control over humanity was no longer enough. Even mastery of the physical universe was no longer enough. Because the threat he feared did not exist in real space, it waited in the warp, where power obeyed different rules, and survival demanded transgression. To escape the fate he had foreseen, the Emperor needed something forbidden. Something ancient. Something never meant to be taken. This is where the history of the Imperium grows deliberately silent. Records fracture. Accounts contradict one another. Words like journey, bargain, and theft appear only in fragments, quickly buried beneath more comfortable myths. But the pattern is unmistakable. The Emperor went into the warp itself, not as a conqueror, but as a thief. He did not go to learn. He went to take. What he stole was not simple power. Power can be measured, transferred, depleted. What the Emperor took was something deeper, a method of persistence. A way for a soul to anchor itself against dissolution. A means of defying the natural cycle that governs even gods. This was the moment immortality stopped being an evolutionary trait or a psychic anomaly and became something artificial, something maintained by forces that were never neutral. The warp does not give without taking. It does not lose without compensating. Every theft creates a debt, and debts in the warp are not measured in time, but in suffering. The Emperor knew this. He understood it better than anyone. And yet he proceeded anyway. Because the debt was preferable to the alternative. Because any price was acceptable if it meant avoiding the fate he feared. From that moment onward, his immortality was no longer his alone. It was entangled, conditional, watched. This is why chaos did not destroy him when it had the chance. This is why his survival was permitted, even enabled, in subtle ways. A living emperor served a purpose. A dying one might escape. As long as he endured, burning, resisting, holding reality together through sheer agony, the warp could feed. On belief, on sacrifice, on the endless emotional output of a species locked in eternal war. The Emperor believed he had outwitted the gods of chaos. In truth, he had made himself indispensable to them. And that realization reshapes everything that followed. The Primarch project, the fragmentation of his own essence, the urgency with which he acted, and the corners he cut. These were not the actions of supreme confidence. They were the actions of a being racing against an invisible clock, knowing that the longer he remained alive, the deeper the hooks sank into his soul. Immortality was no longer about survival. It was about containment. Because once the Emperor took what he took, death was no longer an escape. It became the one thing that could never be allowed to happen. After the theft, after the silent bargain that could never be spoken aloud, the Emperor was no longer whole in the way he once had been. The power he carried was immense, but it was unstable, like a star forced into an unnatural shape. To contain it, to survive it, he needed anchors, extensions of himself that could bear fragments of what he had become. And so the Primarch project was not merely an act of creation. It was an act of division. Each Primarch was more than a general, more than a genetic masterpiece. They were vessels, shards of the Emperor's will, strength, and psychic resonance, separated from him and bound into living forms. Through them, his presence could stretch across the galaxy without tearing him apart. Through them, his immortality could be distributed, diluted, stabilized. This is why they felt him so strongly. This is why their loyalty, or betrayal, cut so deeply. They were not just his sons. They were parts of him walking independently in the world. This also explains the urgency behind their creation. The Emperor was running out of time. The warp does not tolerate imbalance forever, and the power he carried demanded structure. The Primarchs were meant to be that structure, pillars holding up a future where his existence could remain anchored to reality rather than dragged screaming into the immaterial. Humanity would conquer the stars. Reason would triumph over superstition. And the Emperor, at the center of it all, would finally be safe. But then came the scattering. Whether by chaos, fate, or consequences set in motion long before, the Primarchs were torn away and flung across the galaxy. What was meant to stabilize the Emperor instead fractured his plan beyond repair. Each lost son was not just a strategic setback, it was a metaphysical wound. A piece of himself severed, exposed to corruption, shaped by forces he could no longer fully control. This is why their reunions were so intense. Why some were embraced and others regarded with cold calculation. The Emperor was not simply evaluating commanders. He was assessing damage, measuring what had been lost, what could still be used, and what might now be dangerous to bring too close. Because when a fragment of your own soul is twisted, destroying it may be necessary, but it is never painless. The Horus heresy, then, was not just a civil war. It was an internal collapse made external. The Emperor's divided nature reflected in his divided sons, his stolen immortality mirrored in their stolen destinies. When Horus fell, it was not merely rebellion, it was the corruption of a core support, a pillar meant to hold everything together. By the time the final confrontation arrived, the Emperor was already failing. Not physically, but structurally. Too many fragments lost, too much power held together by force alone. His immortality, once a shield against damnation, had become a brittle framework dependent on sacrifices, systems, and suffering to remain intact. And when Horus struck him down, the blow did not end his life. It ended the illusion that his immortality could ever be stable again. The battle with Horus is remembered as a moment of tragic heroism, a final stand where the Emperor sacrificed everything to save humanity. That is the story the Imperium tells. But stripped of its ceremony and myth, the truth is far more unsettling. Horus did not simply wound the Emperor's body. He ruptured the structure holding his stolen immortality together. What was broken that day could never be repaired, not by regeneration, not by technology, not by psychic force. The Emperor's body could not die, but it also could not heal. The mechanisms that once allowed his soul to re-anchor itself after injury were shattered. The warp-bound power sustaining him began to leak outward, uncontrolled and agonizing. This was not survival. It was containment failure. In that moment, the Emperor faced the very fate he had spent millennia trying to avoid, his essence unraveling, his consciousness at risk of being dragged screaming into the warp. And so he made a choice that sealed the fate of the Imperium forever. The Golden Throne was never intended to preserve a living emperor. It was a psychic interface, a control system designed to stabilize human interaction with forces no mortal mind could endure. When he was placed upon it, it became something else entirely. A life support mechanism for a being who could not be allowed to die, and could no longer truly live. The throne did not heal him. It imprisoned him in a moment of endless collapse, freezing his existence at the brink of annihilation. From that point onward, immortality became agony. Every second was pain. Every thought required fuel. The Emperor's vast consciousness was forced to burn itself simply to remain coherent. He could no longer act freely. He could no longer speak. He could barely endure. The god of mankind was reduced to a screaming psychic engine, holding reality together through torment alone. And yet, even then, death was not permitted. Because the consequences of his death had grown too severe. The Astronomican would fail. Warp storms would consume human space. Terra itself might be lost. The Emperor had succeeded in tying humanity's survival to his own continued suffering. To end his pain would be to doom the species he had sworn to protect. This is the final cruelty of his immortality. It became a trap not only for him, but for all of mankind. He could not die without destroying everything. And so he endures, sustained by sacrifice, worship, and endless psychic combustion. A being kept alive not because it is right, but because the alternative is worse. The Imperium believes it is protecting the Emperor. In truth, it is protecting itself from what his death would unleash. Once the Emperor was bound to the Golden Throne, a terrible truth revealed itself: his immortality was no longer self-sustaining. The machinery could hold him in place, stabilize the breach Horus had torn through his existence, but it could not feed what remained of him. A consciousness as vast as the Emperor's does not persist on silence or faith alone. It requires energy, psychic energy, souls. At first, the cost was small, barely noticeable amid the chaos of a wounded Imperium. A few psychers diverted, a few lives extinguished quietly in the depths of the Imperial Palace. It was framed as necessity, as duty, as sacrifice for the greater good. But necessity has a way of growing. What began as a stabilizing measure soon became a requirement. Then a dependency. Then an institution. 1,000 souls a day. Not to empower the Emperor. Not to heal him, but simply to keep him present. To stop his mind from fragmenting completely. To prevent his stolen immortality from collapsing inward and tearing a hole straight into the warp. The Golden Throne became a furnace, and human souls became fuel, burned not for warmth or light, but to delay extinction by one more day. This is the part of the truth the Imperium will never confront. The Emperor is not being sustained by devotion. He is being consumed by it. Every sacrifice feeds the throne, and every moment the throne burns feeds the Emperor just enough to remain conscious enough to suffer. He does not awaken. He does not recover. He endures. And worse still, belief locks him in place. As humanity began to worship him, something irreversible occurred. Faith reshaped him, not into a god of mercy or wisdom, but into a fixed point of expectation. A symbol that could not change, could not die, could not be released. The Emperor rejected godhood in life because he understood what belief does in the warp. But in deathless stasis, belief became another chain. The more humanity prays for him to live, the harder it becomes for him to ever truly let go. The Imperium tells itself this is noble, that 1,000 deaths a day are a small price for survival. But this logic hides a deeper horror. The system no longer exists to save the Emperor. It exists to prevent the consequences of admitting what he has become. A being trapped between states, neither alive nor dead, whose continued existence demands endless human suffering. And somewhere within that shattered consciousness, buried beneath pain, ritual, and time, there may still be awareness. Not command, not strategy, just the knowledge of what is being done in his name. An immortal god does not need sacrifices to live. Only a prisoner does. After 10,000 years bound to the Golden Throne, the most terrifying question is no longer how the Emperor survives, but what is actually surviving. The Imperium insists that he watches, judges, and guides. Visions are recorded. Miracles are proclaimed. Saints rise in his name. And yet, for every sign of divine will, there is an equally troubling contradiction. Silence where commands should be. Inconsistency where purpose should exist. Power without clarity. Action without intent. A mind is not meant to endure unbroken for millennia, especially one subjected to constant psychic combustion. Even with the sacrifice of 1,000 souls each day, the Emperor's consciousness is stretched thin, fragmented, forced to prioritize survival over coherence. Thought becomes instinct. Will becomes reflex. What remains may not be a ruler making decisions, but a vast psychic presence reacting to stimuli, discharging power when certain thresholds are crossed. This would explain the contradictions that plague imperial history. Why miracles save one world and abandon another. Why visions differ wildly between psychers. Why the Emperor's voice is interpreted differently by every faction that claims to hear it. These are not messages from a unified mind. They are fragments, psychic afterimages shaped by belief, filtered through suffering, and distorted by the warp. The Astronomican itself may be the greatest evidence of this. It burns constantly, unwavering, not because it is guided with care, but because it must burn to prevent collapse. It is not a beacon consciously maintained, it is a fire that cannot be allowed to go out. The Emperor does not steer it so much as endure it, his presence acting as the final stabilizing mass at the center of a system that would otherwise implode. And then there is the question of agency. If the Emperor were truly aware, truly capable of choice, would he allow this? Would he permit an Imperium defined by ignorance, cruelty, and endless war? Or is that question itself the answer? Because an Emperor who can no longer meaningfully intervene is an Emperor whose ideals have already died, even if his existence has not. What may remain on the throne is not the man who sought to guide humanity into reason and unity. It may be the psychic skeleton of that man, stripped of nuance, trapped in loops of pain and survival, responding only when the pressure becomes unbearable. A god not because he chose to ascend, but because there was nothing else left for humanity to worship. And this is the most unsettling possibility of all, that the Emperor's greatest fear has already come true. Not death, but survival without self, existence without identity, power without purpose. If that is the case, then the Imperium is not awaiting the Emperor's return. It is orbiting the long, slow aftermath of his fall. One of the most insidious ironies of the Emperor's stasis is that his continued survival benefits the very forces he spent a lifetime trying to destroy. Chaos does not need to conquer a fully alive Emperor, it only needs him to endure. Every moment he remains bound to the Golden Throne strengthens the patterns of suffering, fear, and psychic output that the warp feeds upon. Immortality, once a weapon against damnation, has become an instrument of it. The entities of the warp are patient beyond comprehension. They do not act quickly. They do not rush. They wait, adapt, and manipulate circumstances so that the choices of mortals and immortals alike serve their designs. By anchoring the Emperor's existence to the Imperium, by forcing him into endless psychic labor to hold back the Imperium, the warp has created a paradox. The more he suffers to protect humanity, the more he inadvertently empowers its eternal enemies. Every psyker harvested, every soul consumed, every prayer whispered in devotion becomes fuel. The Imperium may think it is honoring him, sustaining his godhood. In truth, it is feeding the system that keeps the Emperor trapped, and by extension, enriching chaos itself. His pain is their sustenance. His forced endurance is their victory. Even the Primarchs, the scattered fragments of his own being, cannot fully rectify this. Each death, each loss, each betrayal creates psychic shockwaves that reverberate through the Emperor's fragmented consciousness. Chaos thrives not only on human emotion but on instability within its enemies. By binding the Emperor to survival at all costs, the warp ensures that he remains a source of psychic turbulence, a perpetual engine of unintentional power feeding its own dark realm. This is the cruelest irony of all. The Emperor fought endlessly to protect humanity from the influence of the warp, yet in doing so, he became a linchpin in the system that sustains it. Immortality was supposed to be his triumph, his ultimate control. Instead, it is his punishment, a trap that perpetuates the very forces he sought to destroy. And therein lies the lesson the Imperium will never openly admit: survival without freedom is not victory. And the longer the Emperor endures, the more the universe leans in favor of those who lurk in the shadows of the warp. The chains of immortality are not golden. They are forged in agony, strengthened by sacrifice, and maintained by the very belief that humanity holds sacred. In trying to cheat death, the Emperor created a system where even the gods of the warp benefit from his suffering, a paradox of power and torment that may never be undone. By now, it is clear that the Emperor's immortality is not freedom, it is a sentence. Every day, every hour, every thought is spent holding back forces that would otherwise consume not just him, but the Imperium itself. Yet the scale of this endurance has created an impossible dilemma. If the Emperor were allowed to die, the consequences would be apocalyptic. The Astronomican would fail, leaving countless worlds vulnerable to warp storms and the predations of chaos. The Imperium would collapse almost immediately, engulfed in chaos and fire. Humanity, the very species he sought to save, would be obliterated. But to remain alive is no mercy. His continued existence demands unimaginable sacrifice. Each soul taken, each psyker burned, is a necessary cost to stabilize the throne and maintain the psychic light that guides starships across the galaxy. Immortality has become a form of tyranny, not over others but over himself. He is trapped, forced into an existence that ensures survival for millions while perpetuating suffering for millions more. And this is the central paradox that defines his fate. Mercy cannot exist alongside preservation. To release the Emperor from his torment would doom the Imperium. To maintain him ensures the suffering continues indefinitely. Every decision that could save him or ease his pain comes with consequences too terrible to accept. The Emperor's role as savior has become inseparable from his role as prisoner. Even those closest to understanding the truth, Primarchs like Rebute Gilliman or the Custodes who guard the throne, face a dilemma they cannot solve. They know that releasing him could mean annihilation. They know that continuing the sacrifices prolongs suffering. And yet, no alternative exists. Every path forward is a choice between suffering and extinction. The Imperium's survival is anchored to agony, and the Emperor's immortality ensures that the stakes never end. This is the final weight of his sentence. The Emperor's fear of death became the Imperium's perpetual burden. The god who sought to unite humanity now exists as both savior and tormentor, a being whose endurance has become the axis on which the galaxy turns. And in this unbearable truth lies the ultimate horror: the Emperor's immortality is not a gift. It is a curse, one that humanity cannot escape, and one he cannot end. The Emperor's existence atop the Golden Throne is no longer defined by will or purpose, but by endurance. He does not act. He does not command. He barely is. Every thought, every psychic impulse, is consumed by the act of remaining tethered to reality itself. The being who once envisioned the unification of humanity, the architect of empires and wars, now survives as a mechanism, a psychic engine burning endlessly to prevent collapse. Immortality, in this sense, is not triumph. It is torment magnified across 10 millennia. The tragedy deepens when one considers the nature of his awareness. Consciousness is not binary, it exists in layers. The Emperor's body remains alive. His mind persists. But the self, the part that dreams, that hopes, that plans, is fracturing. What remains may be instinct more than identity. Responses to stimuli more than decisions. The vast, guiding intellect that once foresaw centuries of human history now struggles to maintain continuity of thought, piecing together fragments of memory while the machinery of the throne burns endlessly. Yet humanity cannot see this. They worship the image of a god, not the fractured reality beneath the surface. To do otherwise would be to confront a horror so vast that civilization itself might crumble. The Imperium believes it honors him, sustains him, follows him. But the truth is a mirror of despair. The galaxy survives not because of his guidance, but despite the fact that he cannot be freed from the prison of his own creation. Every miracle attributed to him, every victory claimed in his name, is the side effect of suffering, not the fruit of will. And so the Emperor's immortality is double-edged. It protects humanity from extinction, but it also ensures that he will never know relief. Pain is constant. Awareness is constant. Responsibility, eternal. Immortality has become a cycle with no resolution, a loop that consumes both the prisoner and those around him. In the end, the Emperor is no longer the god of mankind in any meaningful sense. He is its axis of suffering, its unyielding engine of endurance, its anchor against a universe that would otherwise collapse into chaos. His immortality is not divine. It is an elaborate, unbreakable cage. And that cage, paradoxically, is both the reason humanity survives, and the measure of the cost it pays to do so. After 10,000 years on the Golden Throne, the Emperor has ceased to exist in any form we would recognize as human, or even godlike. What remains is not a man, not a ruler, not a mind capable of shaping events with intention. What remains is a force of psychic inertia, a presence so vast, so tortured, that it sustains itself only through mechanisms, rituals, and the suffering of others. The being humanity reveres is, in truth, a function, an engine maintaining the fragile balance between survival and annihilation. Consider this: he no longer sleeps. He no longer dreams. The vast intellect that once conceived entire civilizations is now fractured into shards of awareness, reacting instead of planning, enduring instead of acting. His consciousness may catch glimpses of memory, but memory without control is torment. His mind loops through events, intentions, and fragments of thought, over and over, unable to close the cycle, unable to rest. He is awareness without freedom, cognition without release. The Imperium continues to worship him, but worship in this context is cruelly ironic. Every prayer strengthens the chains that bind him. Every soul sacrificed to the throne ensures he remains conscious enough to suffer, yet not conscious enough to intervene meaningfully. Humanity has transformed its God into a tool of survival, a necessary engine, not a living being. The longer he endures, the more his existence benefits neither him nor the ideals he once held. And yet, paradoxically, the universe cannot allow him to die. The Astronomican cannot falter, the Imperium cannot collapse, the warp cannot breach. His death would ripple outward like a catastrophic shockwave, consuming everything his life, such as it is, was meant to protect. Survival, in this context, is not a gift. It is a punishment multiplied by consequence. The Emperor's existence has become a meditation on futility, an eternal endurance where the cost of release is too high, and the cost of continuation is unbearable. He is not a god. He is the longest living prisoner in the galaxy, forced to hold the Imperium together while slowly being destroyed from within. And in that realization, the horror crystallizes. The Emperor's immortality is no triumph of power or will. It is the ultimate punishment, magnified by the faith of a galaxy that will never truly understand the price it pays. The Emperor's immortality, when stripped of legend, ceremony, and hope, is revealed for what it really is, a sentence without end. He is not a guiding light, nor a god delivering justice. He is a being trapped in perpetual agony, sustained by sacrifice, anchored by suffering, and consumed by the very system he created to survive. Every action of the Imperium, every prayer, every life given in devotion, reinforces the prison that holds him in place. Immortality has become the instrument of his torment, and the Imperium's survival depends upon it. And the cruelest part of this reality is its duality. Humanity survives because of his endurance, yet it survives through his suffering. The galaxy worships a symbol of hope that is simultaneously a cage of unending pain. The God of mankind cannot act freely, cannot intervene intentionally, cannot die. He exists as a psychic engine, burning endlessly to hold reality together, and yet, the cost of his freedom would be the annihilation of everything he sought to protect. His fear of death became both a shield and a weapon, a prison and a necessity, and humanity will never know which is which. The Emperor's true curse is not simply that he cannot die, it is that he cannot rest, cannot be free, and cannot escape the consequences of his own choices. Immortality, once the ultimate power, is now an unbreakable chain. And for the Imperium, every victory, every survival, is purchased at the price of a god's torment. No prayers can ease it, no sacrifices can satisfy it, and no mortal mind can comprehend the full scale of what he endures. So when the next psalm is sung, the next world is conquered, or the next victory is claimed in the Emperor's name, remember this: the light at the center of the galaxy is not shining because it is benevolent. It is burning because it cannot be allowed to go out. Humanity owes its survival to suffering so vast that it cannot be fully imagined, and to a being whose immortality is nothing more than an eternal punishment. In the end, the Emperor's story is a warning: immortality is not freedom. Survival is not mercy. And the greatest power in the galaxy can be nothing more than a prisoner.